Chapter 8. Lindsey awoke to sunshine, bird song, and absolute bliss. At first, he didn't recall why. Then he rolled over and beheld Aubrey, curled in on himself like a cat, sheets clenched tight in his fists. Even closed in sleep, dark bruises shadowed his eyes. His black hair fell half on the pillow, half over his face. With no expression to pull at his edges, his perfect mouth took on a bow shape, turned down at the corners. Lindsey reached out to smooth a dark strand back into place. Aubrey's brow flinched, but he slumbered on oblivious. If he didn't look peaceful, he at least appeared less troubled. Either way, he remained the handsomest creature Lindsey knew. He felt content to lie beside him for 1,000 years, but his growling stomach demanded otherwise. Lindsey slipped out of bed and into his dressing gown, pulled the bedclothes back up around Aubrey's ivory shoulders, rang for Charles, and stepped into the hall to make arrangements for tea. By the time the tray arrived, Lindsey had washed up, though he'd yet to exchange his dressing gown for more respectable attire. He spent another quarter hour sitting up in bed, nibbling a biscuit, and rereading his well-worn copy of Lady Audley's Secret by the sunlight streaming in through the windows. One of these sunbeams crept over Aubrey's face at 10:30. His awakening groan drew Lindsey's attention from the book. "Good morning," said Lindsey, as Aubrey shook the sleep from his head. Aubrey glanced up at Lindsey as if he'd only just noticed him. As soon as they locked eyes, Aubrey looked away. "Morning." Lindsey's smile waned. If he didn't know better, he'd say Aubrey seemed ashamed, discomforted at the very least. Lindsey found the idea of Aubrey's discomfort unbearable. "There's tea," he said, thinking perhaps hunger formed the root of Aubrey's ills. "And toast, if you're so inclined. It's all warm yet. I've kept it covered." Aubrey turned away and reached over the edge of the bed for his clothes with a mumbled, "Thank you." "Or muffins?" said Lindsey. "I can arrange for muffins if you'd rather." "Toast is fine." Lindsey set his book aside. Perhaps Aubrey wasn't hungry after all. Something else must have upset him. Before Lindsey could inquire, Aubrey sat up. "Do you have—" Aubrey still wouldn't meet his eyes. "I mean, is there a lavatory?" Lindsey guessed. Aubrey nodded, his face pale as skimmed milk. "Through there," said Lindsey, pointing at the door to his private bath. "Thanks." Aubrey rushed off, pulling on his trousers as he fled. Lindsey chastised himself for failing to offer a dressing gown. "Are you all right?" he called after Aubrey. The door slammed shut. Aubrey. Lindsey's lavatory was a massive marvel of engineering and a testament to the aesthetic triumph of marble. Aubrey noted it only in passing. He sat down hard on the edge of the hip bath, nearly slipped off and took gravity's hint, and settled down on the cold marble floor to consider his situation. The aristocratic vice had come full circle. It had trickled down through society's ranks to the lowest rung until he, pathetic urchin, doubled back up the ladder to retake one of the upper class. Aubrey would have laughed if he didn't feel so ill. For God's sake, what was he doing here? Who did he think he was fooling? Someone knocked on the door. Aubrey jumped up, scrambling for purchase on the tiles. "Aubrey!" The thick wood muffled Lindsey's voice. Aubrey coughed out the squeak in his throat. "Yes, I have a dressing gown for you when you come out. If you need it." Aubrey detected a note of disappointment in his tone. Perhaps Lindsey expected last night's festivities to continue through the morning. Aubrey thought he might be amenable to the notion, but it wasn't his place to suggest it. His place involved gathering his effects and getting out before the situation became embarrassing. Assuming it wasn't embarrassing already. Aubrey had a sinking feeling they'd passed the point of embarrassment long ago and were well underway to total humiliation. Still, he managed to summon up a small "thanks." as he hurriedly cleaned himself up and threw on his clothes. When he opened the door, Lindsey stood on the other side, dressed for the day, leaning against the bedpost with a silk dressing gown thrown over one arm. "Could I interest you in breakfast, at least?" he said. Aubrey, who'd given serious thought to bolting past him, paused. "It's downstairs," Lindsey continued with an apologetic air. "I could have it brought up if you'd prefer." Aubrey swallowed. "Downstairs is fine." Lindsey grinned, tossed the dressing gown on the bed, and led the way down. The country house had seemed grand in the night. Daylight made it resplendent. The breakfast room alone, an entire room set aside for a single meal, was thrice as large as Aubrey's garret. French windows ran from floor to ceiling along the south-facing wall, wringing out every drop of sunshine from the overcast sky. The eggshell wallpaper reflected the light, doubling it, giving the whole room a warm glow. The table could sit 6 comfortably, 10 in the setting Aubrey was used to, and yet only 4 chairs surrounded it. Eggs, buttered toast, bacon, sausage, ham, soft rolls, marmalade jams, and a tea service covered the mahogany sideboard. Enough for an army laid out to feed 2 men. "Help yourself," said Lindsey, as if this were normal. Aubrey reminded himself that, for Lindsey, it was normal. Absurdly normal. Aubrey took what he considered a reasonable portion of eggs and toast. He ignored the temptations of bacon and ham. Best not to get used to such luxuries. It would make it harder when it all came to an end. "Would you like to see the house?" asked Lindsey, after a few moments of silent consumption. Aubrey lowered his egg-laden fork. The mill didn't require him on Sundays, but that was no excuse for sloth. A man focused on self-improvement would have gone home and studied The Engineer. Yet all Aubrey could focus on was the smile lighting up Lindsey's handsome features. "Certainly." Lindsey looked out the window over Aubrey's shoulder. "The weather's fine enough. Shall we start with the gardens and work our way in?" Aubrey supposed so, and said as much. The air outdoors had a crisp quality. Aubrey indulged in deep breaths as Lindsey pointed out features of interest. Aubrey wasn't sure if Lindsey meant to impress or inform him. He was impressed despite himself. "The house was properly built in 1731, Lindsey began. "Before that, it was little more than a hunting lodge. Capability Brown designed the hedge maze, though we've let the topiary go since then. Would you care to see it?" Aubrey hadn't the first idea who Capability Brown was, but he acquiesced to the plan and followed Lindsey across the property. The hedge maze, with 12-foot walls casting impenetrable shadows, gave him pause. Uphill from the house, its elevated position kept its coils hidden. The air of a trap hung around its entrance. "It's not as complicated as it looks." Lindsey stepped into it and looked back at Aubrey. "Just keep making right-hand turns till you reach the centre." "What's in the centre?" Aubrey asked as he caught him up. "I suppose I ought to preserve the surprise, but since you asked, a folly." Aubrey didn't wish to appear as much of a fool as he felt for not knowing what folly meant in this context, so he kept silent. The path twisted, turned, and forked, yet Lindsey's stride never wavered. He kept his head high and his eyes forward. Aubrey, on the other hand, had a devil of a time keeping his own head from swivelling back and forth between the dark alcoves looming on either side. Some contained shaggy green figures, the promised topiary, most overgrown into an unrecognisable state, though Aubrey thought one upright creature with 2 fuzzy antennae might have been a rabbit. Aubrey began wondering if they hadn't taken a wrong turn at some point. Then Lindsey, with a cheeky grin, brought him around the final corner into what he could only suppose was the folly. 6 gleaming white marble pillars supported a domed roof over the larger-than-life-size statue of a woman wearing a sheet and carrying a bow with a nocked arrow. She stood upon her pedestal with a hunter's readiness, a head turned from the altar before her towards the wall of the maze, as if she'd heard something over her shoulder. "Temple to Diana," said Lindsey, when Aubrey looked to him for explanation. It's not original to the maze. Father had it installed as a wedding present for Mother. Rowena and I used to picnic on the altar. Rowena? My sister. Lindsey stepped up to the folly as if it were no more remarkable than a public water pump. Elder sister. Keeps me in line. You'd like her, I think. Aubrey, about to follow Lindsey into the false temple, paused mid-step. None of the other men he'd fucked had tried to introduce him to their families. He'd certainly never met any sisters. Lindsey looked back at him and, seeing his hesitation, added, It's terribly pagan, I know, but I assure you it's quite harmless. Aubrey laughed and approached the folly. Up close he could admire how the sculpted marble mimicked flesh and falling cloth. He could also admire the smooth curve of Lindsey's throat, as Lindsey craned his neck to point out the constellation map engraved in the ceiling. On the way out, the path forked. Aubrey tugged Lindsey towards the shadowy right-hand path. This is a dead end, Lindsey said, a note of apology in his voice. I know, said Aubrey. Then he pulled him into the alcove for a kiss, and had the satisfaction of leading a dazed Lindsey out of the maze. Between maze and manor, Lindsey showed Aubrey a gleaming glass conservatory, the edge of the wooded glen and the stables. Just as Aubrey had predicted, the stables held a variety of handsome steeds. Lindsey listed off their names with a fond glance at each. Aubrey endeavoured to remember them, but found himself distracted by the presence of a groom brushing one of the geldings. The groom didn't regard them, apart from a deferential nod to Lindsey when they arrived. Lindsey had answered him in kind and turned his attention to a chestnut mare. Do you ride? Aubrey, who was keeping a wary eye on the groom, gave a start and turned back to Lindsey. Lindsey, petting the mare's neck, didn't seem to notice anything unusual in Aubrey's behaviour. He awaited his answer with a patient smile. Aubrey struggled to formulate an appropriate response. Where Lindsey thought he'd found a horse to ride, or the space to ride it, he couldn't imagine. I'm afraid I had to give up keeping thoroughbreds in Manchester. They didn't get on with the self-acting mules. He'd meant to temper his sarcasm, he really had. But there it was. He braced himself for Lindsey's anger. He didn't dare turn to see what the groom thought of it. Lindsey blinked, then brought a hand up to cover his mouth, lest his laughter spook the horses. Sorry, he said, when he'd recovered his composure. That was rather stupid of me, wasn't it? He shook his head and spoke on over Aubrey's protests. Would you care to learn? Aubrey eyed the mare towering over him, watched her toss her mane and paw the ground with hooves as big as his face. Another day, perhaps. I look forward to it. Aubrey dared a glance up at Lindsey, who wore a sincere smile and did his best to mirror it. Beyond the stables and behind the house lay a fern garden with an artificial waterfall, installed by Lindsey's mother. As they followed its walkways to the front of the house, Lindsey apologised for not knowing the scientific names of all the represented species. Aubrey assured him he didn't mind. Are you hungry? Aubrey, distracted by the massive marble lions flanking the stairs from the front courtyard to the house, which he'd missed in the dark of the previous night, took a moment to realise Lindsey had spoken to him. It's about time for luncheon, Lindsey continued, undaunted, nodding towards the oxidised copper sundial in the centre of the ornamental water feature. I'm afraid I didn't give Cook much notice of our arrival, but you'd be amazed what she can do with so little. And so Aubrey went back in. Luncheon in the breakfast room. Lindsey actually apologised for using the same room twice, as most of the household staff had moved to London with the family for the season. Included chicken, more ham, fresh greens and mashed potatoes. Lindsey filled Aubrey's plate with some of everything. With ample encouragement from Lindsey, Aubrey polished it off. Then, to his surprise, the cook herself, a rotund, middle-aged woman with a scowl for everything but Lindsey, arrived with a gooseberry tart. Lindsey tucked in as if he hadn't just eaten more food than Aubrey saw in a week. Aubrey picked at his tart with a silver fork. "No good." Aubrey dropped the fork. His head jerked up to meet Lindsey's concerned frown. No, it's fine," Aubrey rushed to reassure him. "I'm just not terribly hungry is all." Lindsey nodded, though his brow remained furrowed. In an effort to smooth it, Aubrey scooped some tart onto his fork. Delicious, but his gut contracted when he tried to swallow. "You don't have to finish it," said Lindsey. "I assure you Cook won't take offence." Aubrey doubted it, but he lowered his fork with a grateful smile all the same. With luncheon under their belts, the tour continued indoors. Corridor on corridor, chamber after chamber, the house seemed endless, and all devoted to nothing more strenuous than an afternoon's light exercise. Compared to the ceaseless industry of Manchester, Aubrey could hardly justify it. Yet when he saw the delight on Lindsey's face at a fern in a terrarium, or his evident joy when Aubrey responded positively to the library, Aubrey couldn't begrudge him an inch of it. "Do you read?" Lindsey asked as Aubrey took in the endless shelves. "For pleasure, I mean." "Haven't the time," Aubrey replied. But Lindsey, head cocked with a listening look on his face, seemed to want more from him, so he continued. "Used to, though, when I was younger. Penny Dreadfuls and such. Nothing like." He waved his arm to indicate the library entire. Lindsey followed the gesture and returned to Aubrey with a smile. He'd be surprised. It looks austere, bound up in leather, but the content is much the same. Aubrey raised an eyebrow, but couldn't withhold a smile of his own. At the other end of the house lay the music room. A harpsichord carved in last century style and painted gleaming white sat at one end of the enormous echoing chamber. Lindsey went straight to it and lifted its lid. A few delicate chords stirred the air, drawing Aubrey's eyes from windows taller than his whole lodging house. Lindsey, realizing he had Aubrey's attention, played some showier notes. Then a self-conscious smile stole over his lips, and he stepped away from the instrument, sitting down on its bench with his back to it. Aubrey sat down beside Lindsey and looked over his shoulder at the harpsichord. The last few notes still hung in the air. "Do you play often?" "No, hardly at all. My sister's the real musician. She used to teach me her lessons as she learnt them, for practice. Used to, until our father sent me to Eton." Lindsey's smile waned. He resisted the notion for years. Finally gave in when I was 13, only to call me home 3 years later. "Why?" Aubrey asked, before his sense of propriety could stop him. Lindsey shrugged. Didn't see fit to explain his reasoning to me. He reached behind himself and played half a scale, his long fingers ambling over the keys. "He's not terribly forthcoming at the best of times. I assume he was dissatisfied with my academic performance." Aubrey, having no experience with parents of any kind, much less those who might care whether he succeeded or failed, changed the subject. "Did you enjoy school?" "I adored it." Lindsey abandoned the harpsichord to fix Aubrey with a look of purest joy. "The books, the sport. I found my dearest friends there." "What sort of sport?" As it turned out, every sort. Lindsey related them all, from cricket to football to rowing and back again, throwing in anecdotes of striking successes or failures in the field. It all lay outside Aubrey's purview. But even what he didn't understand seemed wondrous when delivered with Lindsey's enthusiasm. Bright blue eyes shone with glories of days past, and his hands moved with animated vigour as he described a close boat race. Aubrey pictured those hands clenched around oars, those lean shoulders pulling against the rushing river, bare skin gleaming in the summer sun. "And you?" The spell broke, leaving Aubrey stunned. "Pardon? Did you enjoy school?" Lindsey asked with an expression of eager interest, which made it all the more painful for Aubrey to realise how inadequate his answer would be. "Yes, but it was hardly so exciting as Eton." The ghost of Lindsey's grin remained, but his eyebrows knit in confusion. Aubrey hopped off the bench as if it had bit him. "You said something about a portrait gallery?" Lindsey looked no less confused than before, but stood up regardless. "I did, yes. Shall we?" Aubrey wholeheartedly agreed. Lindsey led the way to a grand hall with a high vaulted ceiling. Originally built for indoor perambulation, thick curtains now covered its wall of impossibly tall windows. Every remaining inch of wall from floor to ceiling displayed framed portraits of blonde, blue-eyed, aquiline-featured people. Several could have passed for Lindsey's doubles, costumes aside. These, then, were Lindsey's ancestors, stretching back through the centuries to William the Conqueror, probably beyond. The entire Althorp clan stared Aubrey down. Aubrey, alone, with no gallery of compact, bow-lipped, large-eyed individuals behind him. Not a single living soul who bore any resemblance. No memory of a face like his looking down into his own. Despite his best efforts, he felt a bit small. "My father." Lindsey pointed to a portrait of a man with a moustache set in a grim line. "He's gone a bit grey since, well, entirely grey." "I see." Aubrey didn't know what else he could say, apart from congratulations to Lindsey for having a recorded past. "And there's their wedding portrait." Lindsey stepped aside to indicate a life-sized, full-figure piece. A younger version of the man stood with a smile pulling up the ends of his moustache and crinkling the corners of his eyes. His hand rested on the back of a chair, in which sat a slender blonde woman with a long neck, a regal bearing, and Lindsey's own smile beaming down on them with the force of 1,000 suns. "Him and my mother, I mean," Lindsey added, as if it weren't immediately apparent. "Alice Althorp. She used to say her middle name was alliteration. Took me ages to work out the joke. In fairness, it sounds a bit like a real name when one is 4 years old." Aubrey wouldn't have known the difference at that age either, and told Lindsey so. Lindsey smiled appreciatively. "Is there a more recent portrait of her?" asked Aubrey. Lindsey's smile vanished. A pathetic imitation replaced it, yet Aubrey felt its absence like an ice-cold draught blowing in through a broken window. "No, unfortunately," said Lindsey. "She passed away when I was 7. His gaze returned to the wedding portrait. Aubrey tried not to notice how ferociously he blinked to force tears back into his eyes. "I'm sorry," said Aubrey. Inadequate words, he knew, but before he could add more, Lindsey cut him off. "Don't be," he said, pulling his pained smile into something more sincere. "She wouldn't stand for it. Never could abide sorrow of any kind." His right hand disappeared into his trouser pocket. His left twitched as if it, too, wished to hide. Aubrey caught it in his own. Lindsey, jerked out of his reminiscence, looked down to their joined hands, then up at Aubrey with a grateful half-smile. Aubrey drew closer, and Lindsey leaned his head atop Aubrey's own. Your parents," Lindsey began. Aubrey stiffened, felt Lindsey do the same against him, and forced himself to relax. "Both deceased. Forgive me, I didn't mean there's nothing to forgive. Happens to everyone eventually." Lindsey squeezed his arm. They wandered back through the house, Lindsey adding a few more interesting details he'd forgotten along the way, till he halted abruptly at the base of the entrance hall stair. "By Jove!" he cried. "We never made it to the theatre!" Aubrey'd forgotten all about it. "It's all right. I don't mind." "Are you sure?" asked Lindsey. "I feel dreadful about it. I did promise, after all." "Promise?" "Offered, then. I fear I've lured you here under false pretenses." "No," Aubrey replied quickly. "You didn't." He, of all people, knew a thing or two about false pretenses and luring. Lindsey didn't notice. "Shall we go tonight? I could take you to dinner beforehand, give Cook a break from us, and us a break from her cooking." Only a fool would turn down a free meal, and it would take a better man than Aubrey to resist the temptation of such a handsome face, bearing such a kind smile. Aubrey answered with a smile of his own. "Then I suppose we're off to the theatre." Nothing distinguished Lindsey's club from the rest of Pall Mall until Aubrey entered. Though the staff welcomed him as Lindsey's guest, The other members fixed him with cold stares. Their everyday attire put Aubrey's best and only jacket to shame. Even the staff had more polish. But Lindsey didn't seem to see anything amiss with Aubrey's appearance. Aubrey gave silent thanks and turned his attention to the food, more than enough to sate his appetite. Then he and Lindsey left the club's indignant eyes behind for the glamour of the theatre. St. James's Theatre was only marginally more opulent than the Althorp estate. Aubrey wasn't the worst-dressed man there. Plenty of other theatre-goers had similar attire, but none of them stood beside Lindsey in his tailored evening jacket and silk waistcoat. And they certainly didn't have Lindsey's gentle hand on their elbows, guiding them out of the lobby to the magnificent stone stair leading up to the private box reserved for the Althorp family. In Lindsey's words, both he and his sister adored the theatre. Aubrey assumed their father felt indifferent towards it. The theatre's interior had cream-coloured walls gilded with gold inlay, framing murals of frolicking youths. Aubrey wondered how anyone could concentrate on the stage with the house so decorated, though his own interest lay in the electric chandelier far above the audience. He tried to restrain himself, but Lindsey caught him looking up. "The lights," Aubrey explained. "Electric." Lindsey followed his gaze upward. "So they are." The lights dimmed soon after, much to Aubrey's relief. In the dark, no one could gawk at the shabby little man sitting beside the elegant Mr. Althorp. Aubrey hadn't heard of the play, Lady Windermere's fan, but Lindsey assured him his friend Graves, a literary critic, had judged it acceptable. It proved better than acceptable. Aubrey laughed outright twice in the first act, surprising himself as much as Lindsey. It could have been a terrible play for all Aubrey cared. The experience of sitting with Lindsey in the privacy of a dark theatre box thrilled him even more than he'd imagined. Their shoulders pressed together from the moment the lights went down, and Lindsey's hand meandered over to rest on Aubrey's thigh as the evening progressed. It left Aubrey giddy as the curtain closed for intermission. But whatever plans he had for entertainment between acts were dashed by the arrival of an usher bearing a note for Lindsey. Lindsey took the note, smiled at it, and gave an affirmative reply. "Graves is in the box opposite," he said after the usher departed. Aubrey peered across the house as if he could discern a specific stranger at such a distance. "He'd like to stop by for a quick chat," Lindsey continued. His sunny serenity turned to concern. "You don't mind, do you?" Inwardly, Aubrey panicked. Foolish enough to agree to accompany Lindsey in public, but he'd done it assuming no one would notice or remember him. An introduction to Lindsey's friend hadn't factored into Aubrey's calculations. Outwardly, Aubrey assured Lindsey he didn't mind. It took some time for Graves to arrive. Aubrey and Lindsey spent it watching the crowd below, until an usher behind them cleared his throat and announced, "Lord Cyril Graves!" Aubrey turned and came face to face with Mr. Holloway.